Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. As we just said, welcome to everyone who's joining us here, and also welcome to everyone who's watching online. Tonight is our 80th lesson. It's from our book, A Journey to Faith, and it's called The Four Winds of Heaven Begin to Blow. The reason for that is that we're at the time in the Bible where we're following biblical prophecy through the book of Daniel. And one of the things that Daniel receives, both in a vision and a word from the angel Gabriel, is he talks about the four kingdoms that are going to come after the Greek ram enters from the west, which is Alexander the Great, and how he doesn't have any descendants, or he won't have any descendants who will rule after him. And so what happens? The kingdom separates, and it's going to separate amongst people who are not members of his family. And so this is the portion that we're up to today. So we're just going to give a little background as we get underway. So firstly, the genealogy of Jesus, which this is based on. So found in the book of Matthew in chapter 1. So the very first thing you read in the New Testament is the genealogy of Jesus. And it spells out the connection from the time of Abraham to David and then through to Jesus Christ. In the line-by-line descriptions of who all of those descendants or forefathers of Jesus is, descendants of Abraham, forefathers of Jesus, we get to the point between verses 12 and 17 where it talks about those people who come after the exile to Babylon. And we find ourselves in this period of time where after King Jehoiakim and Zerubbabel, we find that there is no biblical story, no direct story for any of the descendants. And so we read the books of the Bible to find out what happens to each of these people, and then we get to a point where the books of the Bible no longer give us a direct story, but the prophetic words of the book of Daniel provide us a matching mechanism with history to see what was going on in that period of time. So we're currently up to Zadok, and Zadok is the 7 generations before Jesus, and we're just currently in the early 300 BC, so we're gradually drawing closer and closer to the time of Christ. Now, on this chart, we have Zadok up the top here. We've already left the Persian Empire behind. We've already left Alexander III behind, and we've now come down into this period of time where he has a brother who's called Philip III of Macedon, and he's mentally handicapped, so he's not deemed fit to rule, and so they don't want him to rule, even though he would have the authority to. And he has a son who, when he passed away, was not yet born, and he was named Alexander after him, and he's called Alexander IV of Macedon, but he's so young, he actually can't rule, and so they need a regent to rule in his absence. And so this fellow, Perdiccas, who was the highest ranking officer in the palace, he was actually given the signet ring of Alexander the Great, and that gave him the authority to take care of everything after Alexander left. So last week we had a bit of a look at that, and we found that he sort of stepped away from it, like he didn't want to accept the responsibility. But the way it ended up panning out in the end was that he was appointed, and there was factions formed as a result of that. The next 3 kings that come in the same colour as Zadok during his life are actually the people who will become rulers of separate portions of the total empire. And so we have Antagonist. Now he, we'll introduce him tonight, but he actually comes from the north, from Asia Minor, today's Turkey. We have Seleucus Nicator, and he will come from the east, so he's actually going to become a person who rules from Babylonia. And then we've got Ptolemy, who will actually rule Egypt and Libya and Sudan, those sort of regions there. So these people are all in play during the life of Zadok. Okay. As we do each week, you might notice I've taken the word Yehud Medinata off because it's no longer a Persian province. It's now still a province, but it's now a province of Syria, and it's part of the Greek Empire. History records it as the Greek Empire, but in fact it's not. It's actually a Macedonian Empire, because all of these rulers are from Macedon. in this map, this is from last week, and this spells out the journey of Alexander the Great. So when he came across the Dardanelles at the Hellespont, which is Gallipoli as we remember it, he came across through Asia Minor. He had the battle at Issus against Darius III. Darius lost and did a runner, and he thought he would be chased by Alexander the Great. But Alexander, of course, was a bit more strategic, and so he followed down the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which is known as the Levant, and he had all of these interactions in the ancient area of Phoenicia and the island of Tyre, which he turned into a landmass. He built a causeway out there, and today it's actually part of Lebanon, and it's no longer an island as a consequence of Alexander. He then went down to Gaza, won a battle, and then he returned up to Samaria and into Jerusalem. So we've already been through that journey. From there he went down to Pelusium, to the beginning of the border for Egypt, and he was welcomed with open arms, and he ended up in Memphis, where he ruled for a short period of time, for a few months, and he was turned into a god. So he became known as the son of Zeus Ammon, and because his mother's name is called Olympias, okay, or Olympia, thank you. And so as a consequence of that, we see in all of the memorabilia of Alexander the Great that he has these horns, and the horns come from the goat, and this was actually part of the symbolism used by the Egyptians, and then it became on coins. And we read in the Bible, of course, that he is the shaggy goat, and so we see that connection of the symbolism tied to the time that he was made into a god into Egypt. From there he headed back, and he went along this path here. There's another battle at Gaugamela, and then the chase was on all the way through the empire until we get up to Hyrcania, and Darius III was actually left to die by his own son, Bessus, who was the governor of this area here in Bactria, and then Alexander chased them across until this final battle was won here. At this point in time, Alexander was a pretty thirsty guy, so he wanted to keep going further east, but all of his troops started saying, "We've had enough, can we go home?" And so he agreed, and then he returned back to Persis, to Persepolis, across to Susa, back to Babylon, and this ended up becoming the centre of the empire. So tonight when we talk, Babylon is actually where the empire was ruled from, but Macedonia is where the heritage comes from. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to maintain the relationship between what they see in the east and what they see in the west. So it was the first time that Asia, as it's known, and Europe actually started to cross-pollinate with culture, with the false god worship. They changed hands and went back and forth, and trade, of course, as well. So this just gives us a bit of a background up to where we are at this point in time. On the 11th of June, 323 BC, Alexander the Great passed away at the age of 32, fulfilling the word of the Lord given to Daniel in a vision. In Daniel 8:8, it says, "The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven." So this is the component that we're looking at. Reading on from there, the Archangel Gabriel interpreted this in Daniel 8 verses 21 to 22, and he said, "The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, Alexander the Great, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will never have the same power." And so this is what Daniel had to say. For anyone who hasn't seen it before, this is a identikit picture, you could call it, of Alexander the Great. There were so many carvings, there was tiled images made of him, there was busts that were carved of him, and so they had a very good understanding of what he looked like. So this actually comes from Macedon. People there spent a long time researching and recreated what they believed he would have actually looked like. He was 20 when he started to rule, and he was 32 when he passed away, so he was very young. So that's what that picture's there for. Now, As we hit this moment now, we're going to go to Daniel chapter 11, and we're just going to read between verses Daniel 11 verses 2 to 4. So this is basically the scripture upon which tonight's lesson is based. So Daniel 11 verses 2 to 4. And it reads, "Now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th," and you'll see this come to light tonight, "who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will appear who will rule with great power and do as he pleases, Alexander the Great. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others." And so we have a very direct message there that this period of success is now going to become fractured in essence by these separate powers. It says, when Alexander the Great died, he had a brother called Hideus, who carried the title Philip III of Macedon, an unborn boy whom when born was called Alexander after his father and given the title Alexander IV of Macedon. So they're 2 people that are going to keep recurring for a short time. Now Philip III of Macedon was deemed mentally unfit to rule, and Alexander IV of Macedon was too young. So a regent by the name of Perdiccas ruled, whom Alexander the Great gave his signet ring to as he lay on his deathbed. This fulfils the word of the Lord given to Daniel, which said the rule of the Macedonian (Greek) Empire would not go to his descendants. And so, coming to where we're up to now, the Petition of Babylon. So Perdiccas held a conference to appoint the commanders who were deemed as generals of the late king, Alexander the Great, to govern various territories throughout the empire. And so here I put a list of the participants. And they were broken into 2 factions. So when they were arguing about what should happen, we see there's the cavalry, which is of course those who ride the horses, and then there's the infantry, which are the foot soldiers. And so you can see the majority of the people who were associated with Alexander the Great, who were closest to him, were actually from the cavalry. And what that tells you is that he led his army from the front. Okay? And then from the infantry, there was 1 general. So here's Perdiccas that we've been mentioning. So he was an army commander. There's this fellow called Leonatus, an officer. Ptolemy, who will rule over Egypt, which we've mentioned. He's actually a friend and a biographer, so he's not a military person. Lysimachus, a bodyguard. Aristonus, a bodyguard. Python, officer and bodyguard. Seleucus, he's going to become another person who's going to be one of the 4 kingdoms. He's a commander of what's called an agema, which is an elite body who guarded Alexander the Great, and there was Eumenes, who was the secretary. So there was all of these people, and they were all arguing because one of them wanted Alexander the 4th, the son, to be the next ruler, and of course some of the others believed that Alexander's brother Philip III should be the ruler. And so they separated into these 2 factions of support. Okay, so I'll just put that up behind me, this map, and I'll explain it as we go. It says, having settled in these positions, Perdiccas then arrested the most troublesome leaders of the conflicts on the pretext that King Philip III of Macedon had ordered him to purge the army. Now, of course, he's deemed unfit to actually rule, and yet he's using the pretext that this person who's unfit for ruling is actually telling him what to do. But because he's the regent, he can pretty much say what he likes and do what he likes, and so this is what he actually says. So Perdiccas had them put to death, and by asserting his authority as a new chiliarch or a commander of the entire empire, he struck fear throughout the army. And although he had made his chief antagonist his lieutenant, it was soon after that he also put Meleager, who was the one representative from the infantry, he had him put to death. So in other words, he's sorting out all these people in these factions to have the people left whom he actually wants. So these executions led to a mutual suspicion between Perdiccas and the remaining leaders and commanders. But Perdiccas, under the pretext that he was acting under the orders of King Philip III, still decided to appoint men whom he didn't trust to various provinces. So these appointments will lead to the Macedonian Empire being what the Bible tells us in Daniel 11:4, uprooted and given to others. So this is the premise of tonight's lesson, literally fulfilling what Daniel says, that there's going to be these 4 new kingdoms and that none of them will be descendants of Alexander the Great. So the first one, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who we've mentioned, the friend and biographer of King Alexander the Great, was appointed to rule Egypt, Libya, and parts of Arabia close to Egypt. And so this territory here was given to Ptolemy over here. Now the province of Syria that covered the territories of the Levant, I think I've got the only fly in this room buzzing around me here in the light. The province of Syria that covered the territories of the eastern Mediterranean between Egypt and northern Syria was given to a commander called Laomedon, who knew the Persian language and was deemed suitable to rule the former Persian territories. So of course this included Jerusalem, and the sub-province of Judea now came under his control. And so I've marked this territory because we're following the biblical journey. And so Jerusalem and Judea now become part of this new and much larger territory than before. So it's known as Syria or Coal Syria, and that's going to affect their lives because that's the particular ruler who's going to be overseeing them all. Now in Asia Minor, I'm not going to go through all of them, but this region over here, there's many different former kingdoms, and so there was many different rulers who were given appointments here. But the one that I'm going to mention is called Antagonist Monophthalmus, and he's going to rule from up here in Greater Phrygia. So he's one of the people who's going to become one of the leaders of the future kingdoms. Now his name, I put this up a bit later, but he's known as Antagonist Monophthalmus. Anyone's Latin any good? We've got a nurse here. Monophthalmus or ophthalmus. It means one, so mono, and it's actually talking about one eye. And so he's remembered in history for having one eye. And so that's the origin. So we always see that the ancient names tell us something about the person. Be interesting to know what our names would be given to us today basing on our looks and our characteristics. But he was called Monophthalmus, perhaps is the correct way to say it. And so he's a person that we're going to come back to, and again he's going to rule from over here. And then in Europe, Thrace and the Chersonese, which is the Gallipoli Peninsula here. So we're now talking about everything on the other side over here. And the many neighbouring people of Thrace as far as Salmondesis on the Black Sea, so that's up here, that's far north as it goes, was given to a fellow called Lysimachus, who was a Macedonian officer. So again, lots of names. And then once again, there was many more satrapies to the east. So this is obviously a large area. And some of those were appointed to new people, and many of them were left the same as Alexander the Great had them. So that's as much detail as I'll give you there, so it doesn't get too confusing. So next, it was necessary for Perdiccas to connect Macedonia, so where they all come from, to the empire's capital in Babylonia. So they all originate from just over here off the map, and this is now the current place from which they're ruling the empire. So they want to keep their ties in place. So to do this, he deemed that it was necessary to conquer Cappadocia in Asia Minor, and that's where this white circle is here, or oval shape, because Alexander the Great passed through there, but he didn't actually conquer it, and so it sort of became a kingdom on its own right, separate to everything else. So he decided that they needed to go back there and conquer it. So So Antagonist, who we've mentioned, the Macedonian governor of Phrygia, had become used to defending the road between Macedonia and the east from attacks in that region. But when Perdiccas invaded and conquered Cappadocia, Antigonus was oddly nowhere to be seen. Okay, so what they found out is that he failed to assist Perdiccas, and he was asked to stand before a military court, but being a good upright citizen, he did a runner and he fled over to Macedonia to the ruler called Antipater. So Antipater was the ruler who was left there, and he was the most senior commander when Alexander left. So when he first left, he actually left him in control of home affairs, basically. And so this fellow fled and joined him over there. So the consequence of this led Perdiccas to appoint a new governor called Eumenes, who we had on that list, and some of the territory in that region. So up until this occurred, Perdiccas had also been engaged, and this is how it gets nice and complicated, to Nicaea, the daughter of Antipater, so the ruler from over here in Macedonia. He was actually engaged to her, but in late 322 BC he broke off the engagement when the mother of Alexander the Great offered his sister Cleopatra in marriage. So Alexander the Great's sister was called Cleopatra. We'll come across many Cleopatras later. You may think that Cleopatra is actually an Egyptian name, but you'll realise here that it's actually not. Okay, so we'll come back to that later, but his sister was called Cleopatra. So this marriage would make Perdiccas a member of the royal house, so he's actually got a plan behind him because he wants to take over the whole empire. And he thought that this would give him the opportunity to become king, as said, rather than being the regent. But the Bible tells us, and this is what he should have done, he should have opened the Bible and he should have read the book of Daniel, and he would have realised that this is not going to happen. And so when we read the book of Daniel, and again we go to Daniel chapter 11 verse 4, the same thing, the archangel Gabriel, when he gave his word to the prophet Daniel, made it clear that the empire will be broken up, so Daniel 11:4, and will be given to others. And so all of his efforts and his planning right now are in vain. So receiving news that his daughter Nicaea had been rejected by Perdiccas, Antipater, of course, was insulted. So a fellow by the name of Craterus, who is Macedonia's highest ranking officer and supreme commander of the forces in Europe, was also insulted when Perdiccas, he saw him as only the highest ranking officer of the court. So they obviously deemed those who were leading armies were a higher rank than those who were in the court. And so he was insulted when he had been selected by Alexander the Great to be the regent rather than himself. So all these people were taking offence, basically, that somebody else is getting these positions rather than themselves. And so now, added to that, this fellow Antagonist Monophthalmus had fled Perdiccas in fear. And so I'm just going to put up this next screen, and we're going to start spelling this out. So basically Craterus, that is his name there, and Antipater controlled most of the Greek nations in Europe, and joined by Antigonus they decided to revolt against Perdiccas and his authority as regent and chiliarch of the Macedonian Empire. So this is the first of the four winds of heaven that the Bible talks about had begun to blow, and this wind came from the west, so the west was first again. So the rulers from here and the ruler who had come from across here to join them have decided that they're going to rebel against Perdiccas, who's ruling from Babylon. So no sooner had this empire been set in place than it's starting now to come to blows. And so we're just going to leave that up while I speak from the next section. Now remember the four winds of heaven description, the references are there in both Daniel 8:8 and Daniel 11:4. So in December 321 BC, so still in the same year, but right at the end, Perdiccas finally had the honey-filled gold sarcophagus, we mentioned this before, of the body of King Alexander the Great sent to be entombed in a place called Aegae, or it's like the Aegean, excepting it's the letters are the other way around, so we'll say a J, the religious capital of Macedonia, apparently, it was known as. And so the gold casket that contained the sarcophagus was placed into an immense carriage drawn by many horses. So we mentioned on an earlier lesson that when Alexander was passed away, he was placed inside a coffin. They poured honey in around his body as a preservative, and then he was put then inside a sarcophagus, a bit like the Egyptians were doing, except they were embalming. So a two-step process. So he was put into an immense carriage drawn by many horses, but when the funeral procession arrived in Syria's capital city of Damascus, Ptolemy, who was the governor of Egypt, convinced the commander in charge that the former king had wanted his body buried in the temple of his heavenly father, the god Zeus Ammon. So again, that influence comes through that's used as the description in the Bible of the shaky goat. The procession changed course, and passing by the sub-province of Judea, the king's body made its way south down along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean before crossing the Sinai Peninsula to be taken to a new city of Alexandria, west of the Nile Delta. We mentioned this before, but this is Alexandria. This has a big place in biblical history from now on. Modern Bibles are based on what was written there, so we're going to come to that later. It was actually called Alexandria for a reason. We did mention that there's actually numerous other cities that were also called Alexandria. So Kandahar, which we know from Afghanistan today, it was also called Alexandria. A place called Herat, which is also in today Afghanistan, was also called Alexandria. And Kabul, also from Afghanistan, was also called Alexandria in the day. So there's some of them that I've put on there, but there were several others that were all called after Alexandria. So if you're saying I'm going to Alexandria, you would have to verify which one you're going in which direction. But it's this one over here on the other side of the Nile Delta where he was being taken. So Ptolemy's obviously decided he's going to keep the body of Alexander the Great. And what would that do for his kingdom as he's seeing, or his territory? That means that he would see himself as very important, that people would come there to visit and trade, and so he's taken this decision. So Perdiccas considered this a provocation and decided to invade Egypt. At the same time, he ordered Eumenes, who was the governor of Cappadocia, and some of the territory along the Black Sea to defend Asia Minor against the coming armies of Antipater and Craterus. So what we find is that the Egyptians, down here, or the Ptolemy, who's representing the Egyptians, was siding with those from ancient Greece against the empire. Now, this is the same story that happened when they came together against the Persians. So we find that those alliances still seem to be in place. Now, on the cover for tonight's lesson, I had this picture, and this is called Alexander's Cataphalc, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which actually means his funeral procession. And so this was drawn contemporary to the time. It's quite an extraordinary picture. I'll move over to the other side. And you see here all of these multiple, well, it's actually 4 rows. There's, I think I count 12 heads on each of them, so there'd be 48 horses towing this, so you could see the sheer size of it. And Alexander's sarcophagus is actually inside of this, and they've got a procession where they're taking his body to put him to rest. But of course, the whole caravan's been snookered, and they've turned it around and they've headed down to Egypt rather than across to Macedonia where it was intended to go. But from this we get a great insight into the grandeur of it, the size of it. We see the clothing that's been worn by the army at the time. So it gives us a really good picture of what's actually going on. You can see here in the background there's actually palm trees here, so it tells you that they're not going north, they're heading south into the hotter climate, so it's a bit of a giveaway for the nature of the story. So when this happened and they joined together, this fellow called Eumenes accepted, and they engaged in battle with the army of Craterus and defeated them. So Craterus was killed, and his remnant forces left the battle to join with Antipater. So I'll just put this up on the screen. So we're now going to move to the second of the 4 winds of heaven, which we find in Daniel 8 verse 8 and Daniel 11 verse 4. And what we find from these events that happen is that the second winds of heaven has begun to blow. And of course this is Ptolemy down here in the south, because what he's done is he's resisted Perdiccas and he's redirected Alexander's entombed body to be buried there. So this is now the second direction. Now take notice that as we're talking about 4 directions: north, south, east and west. And so this is from the Bible. So the centre of the compass is where? Whenever we talk about the Bible, it's in Jerusalem. And so when we talk about directions, obviously this is a flat map. It's not sitting on the globe, which is curved. But you'll find that when it's placed on the globe in its natural state, that Egypt is south, Thrace and this portion from Phrygia across to here is north. Obviously, is west, beg your pardon. Over here is north, and all across this way is east. So we're going to come across those other directions in a moment. But at this point in time, those from the west and those from the south have got their winds blowing, meaning that things are starting to change and they're separating themselves from the rest of the empire. So the story says that Perdiccas took King Philip III, so that's the brother of Alexander the Great, to Egypt. They reached Ptolemy's province in May in 320 BC, and they crossed the Sinai Desert to reach the Nile River near Pelusium on the eastern side of the Nile Delta. But Ptolemy made it clear that he was abandoning the pretense of being a province when he stopped Perdiccas from crossing the river. So Perdiccas went down there to say, "Oi, what are you doing? Give me the body back." And he says, "Sorry, you're not coming over that river." And so the natural boundary for Egypt on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, he said, "That's it, that's as far as you're coming." So Perdiccas apparently then moved further south to the apex of the Nile Delta, near a place called Heliopolis, which is the former city of On, which is where Joseph ruled Egypt from. And so this place is located, I'll come to this. This place of On is just located right near Memphis. Okay, so you've got the Nile Delta, and then you've got, so it's a bit hidden by my cloud, you've got the Nile Delta here, and Memphis is just here, and so this location is right close by there. And he tried to cross the river again, only to have the swift water carry his men away. So the remaining men decided that Perdiccas was not going to invade Egypt when they revolted, so they gave up on him. And Perdiccas consulted his officers, and they were called Pithon, Antigenes, and Seleucus, or Seleucus. And Seleucus is going to be the fourth wind who comes blowing from the east. So we're going to come to him in a moment. So he was there, but they turned on him, and what did they do to him? They killed him. And so the ruler from Babylon was gone, and Seleucus was one of those who murdered him. So the death of Perdiccas ended the civil war that had begun to engulf the empire. Now, in history, these are all recorded, and they're known as the Diadoch War, and I'll just explain it. So the first generation of military and political leaders who succeeded Alexander the Great were called Diadochi, which means successors. And this conflict between them was called the First Diadoch War because it's between all of these commanders. So this is the historical way of remembering it. You can go and look all of this up. So with the death of Perdiccas, Ptolemy was put forward to become the new regent, but not wanting to risk losing control over his own province, he refused and put forward an officer called Pithon and another called Aridius, who had accompanied Perdiccas. They were deemed incapable of keeping the empire together, and the Macedonian commanders decided to come together in a central meeting in a place called Triparadisus, and it's thought to be in today's Lebanon. So that's... And so here's Sidon. This region here is Lebanon today. And so it was just in this location here where they had this meeting. So you can see that if people were travelling for a meeting, they've got to go this way, and this way. And so this is obviously deemed an appropriate place for them to come together. So it's remembered in history as the Treaty of Tripolitania, and Antipater, the most senior of the remaining commanders, who was over in the Greek and Macedonian area, he was appointed the new regent and wanted to keep the empire united and stop the governors like Ptolemy from separating. So they were going to try and hold together the empire. So Antipater reassigned many of the provinces once again, with the exception of Egypt, Libya and the west, which remained with Ptolemy. The province of Judea, under the governance of Syria, remained with a fellow called Laomedon. I think his name's on the board here behind me. Yeah, there he is there. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, Laomedon or Laomedon of Mytilene. So he was a former commander of the Macedonian army. And so we've already had a conflict or a decision that's now looking at reappointing these areas. So I won't mention all of the others, but what we find out that actually happens here is that this fellow Antagonist Monophthalmus, he keeps his. But the murders of Perdiccas were also elevated, and one of the people who was actually elevated was Seleucus, one of the three who murdered him, and he was given Babylonia, from where the third of the four winds of heaven will later begin to blow in the east. And so we've got this notice here. So Babylon is the capital for ruling the empire. The region of Babylonia was given to this fellow called Seleucus. So he's the person who will become the leader of the third kingdom that the Bible is talking about. So we're just putting names to each of these people who will represent in the future. So very historical tonight, but it's every step just continues to fulfill the biblical word. So Antipater then appointed people to collect taxes and commanders to lead the military forces throughout the empire. He retained his position as a supreme commander in Europe and appointed Antigonus to the position of supreme commander of the Macedonian forces in Asia Minor. So in other words, he was given even more power for the purpose of finishing off the wars and executing this fellow called Eumenes, because he had stood against Antipater as an ally of Perdiccas. Antipater then returned to Macedonia late in the year of 320 BC as regent, with King Philip III of Macedon in his care. So that's the brother of Alexander. So they're no longer in Babylon. He's now taken him away. Now, he didn't get to rule, though, because he was actually an elderly man. So in the autumn of 319 BC, his age caught up with him, and after a period of illness, he died in his bed at the age of 80. So again, the word of the Lord, and this is the thing that we're tracking, the word of the Lord given by the Archangel Gabriel to the prophet Daniel that said, the power to rule the Macedonian Empire will not go to his descendants, was fulfilled. But what became clear was the civil wars remembered in the history as the wars of the Diadochi were leading to an empire, again Daniel 11:4, that will be broken up and given to others. So every step of the way we see confirmation of biblical prophecy. Okay, so when Antipater was on his deathbed, not only did he bypass King Philip III of Macedon and his young nephew Alexander IV to rule, but he bypassed his own son, who was called Cassander, and a fellow by the name of Polyperchon, who was an elderly commander who served Alexander the Great, was appointed in his place as the new regent and supreme commander. And Cassander was given this position of chief counsellor. So once again, the power to rule, so as the generation changes, did not go to any of Alexander's descendants. So Cassander was not happy being second in authority, so we're going to read a little bit of historical documentation which tells us what happens. So there's a Greek historian called Diodorus of Sicily, who authored a book called the Bibliotheca Historia, which means Library of World History in English. And he described what happened in his 18th volume. So if you ever want to go to sleep one night, it's scintillating reading for you. So it reads, Cassander, however, was incensed at the idea that his father's authority should pass to someone who was not related by blood, so the bloodline was an issue. At first he went into the country with his friends, where he had ample opportunity and leisure to converse with them on the subject of supreme command. Then he would take each one of them aside in private and urge them to assist in securing his dominion. By great promises he made them all willing allies in his enterprise. He also sent messengers in secret to Ptolemy to renew his friendship with him and invite him to be his ally, and send with all haste a navy from Phoenicia to the Hellespont. Similarly, he sent messengers to the other leading men and the Greek cities to urge them to join his side. So Cassander successfully allied himself with Ptolemy, who had his own aspirations to be independent, and even received the support of a lady called Eurydice, who is the wife of the intellectually impaired King Philip III of Macedon, who, like the others, also had aspirations to rule. So we find that the wife behind the intellectually impaired brother of Alexander the Great had her eyes on ruling as well. So it's like a good movie, isn't it? So rebellion was afoot. The unity of the Macedonian Empire was under threat. So let's see what Diodorus writes about what happens next. So Polyperchon, who's the elderly regent who was appointed, assuming the guardianship of the kings, and held a meeting of his council with his friends. With their approval, he summoned Olympias, the mother of King Alexander the Great, inviting her to assume the care of Alexander's son, who was still a child, and to take up residence in Macedonia with royal authority. So we know the brother was already there. Now he's saying, well, why don't you come along with the child as well? Now, the reason she wasn't there is because she'd had a disagreement with this leader Antipater in the past. So in Asia, as the news of Antipater's death was noised about, revolutionary stirrings began to be felt as those in positions of authority sought to work for their own ends. Chief among these was Antagonist. He had previously defeated Eumenes in Cappadocia. In addition, he had been chosen by Antipater general of Asia with full powers and appointed commander of a large army. All this filled him with self-importance and pride. He was hoping to achieve supreme power and resolved to ignore the kings and their guardians. He reckoned that his superior army would make him master of the treasures in Asia, since there was no one in a position to oppose him. With all this in mind, he summoned a historian by the name of Hieronymus, a friend and fellow citizen of Cardia, who had taken refuge with him at the fort called Nora. He attempted to win him over with lavish gifts and sent him an embassy to Eumenes. Let Eumenes forget about the battle they had fought in Cappadocia, become his friend and ally, receive far more gifts than he had ever done before, and a larger satrapy or larger governance. And in general be ranked the first of his friends and participate in his whole enterprise. So he's clearly trying to butter this fellow up. So Antagonist then immediately called the council of his friends, communicated to them his ambitions for supreme power, and assigned governors to some of his most prominent followers and military commands to others. He filled them all with great hopes and made them enthusiastic for his own plans. For it was his intention to overrun Asia, expel the existing governors, and organise the appointments in favour of his friends. And so we see these two factions against each other. So Antagonist Monophthalmus joined Cassander and Ptolemy, and this was what was known as the Second Diadoch War. So we see these stages of wars where new alliances are being made. Okay. So the alliance between Antagonist, Cassander and Ptolemy was incompatible, because Ptolemy, as the governor of Egypt, sought a divided empire so he could rule over an independent kingdom. So just keep in mind, as they're all jostling for position, none of them actually have independent rule of a kingdom yet. They're still under the overall empire. They're still obliged to pay taxes and so on at this stage. But they're all wriggling around getting their own authority. So Antagonist and Cassander wanted to keep the empire unified, but they differed in that they only saw themselves as the next regent. So everyone wants to be the top dog, and so they all keep fighting. So for this reason, for that moment in time, they put their personal interests aside and came together to remove this Polyperchon as the new regent. So they wanted to get rid of him first. So Macedonian unity collapsed and war broke out. Antagonist and Ptolemy supported Cassander, while Polyperchon allied himself with his other fellow called Eumenes, but Cassander was stronger and he drove him Polyperchon from Macedonia. The history of it tells us that on the run, Polyperchon fled to Epirus in the northwest of Greece and took the infant Alexander IV, so he took the son of King Alexander the Great and his mother Roxanne with him. In the spring of 317 BC, with Polyperchon out of the way with Alexander IV, Cassander's success led him to be recognised as Macedonia's next ruler, and he became the regent of King Philip of Macedon. So the brother and the son have been separated once again. So Olympias, the grandmother of Alexander IV of Macedon, had chosen to remain outside of this conflict, but knowing her grandson was the only legitimate successor of her son, she decided to form an alliance with Polyperchon, who had him in his care. So this is the elderly regent. The soldiers of Macedonia supported her and joined with the army of Polyperchon. King Acides from this place called Epirus in Greece also joined with the armies of Polyperchon and Olympias, and together they invaded Macedonia in 317 BC. At this time, Cassander was further south fighting in the Peloponnese, and so it was only King Philip III of Macedon and his wife who were there to resist them with their army. When their army faced the invaders, they deserted and joined them, with the exception of Cassander's brother and 100 supporters. King Philip III of Macedon, his wife Eurydice, Cassander's brother and supporters were all captured, and they were subsequently executed. And so another claimant on the throne, a legitimate claimant, as the brother of Alexander, was actually killed. So this only left Alexander IV of Macedon as the only legitimate heir of his father, King Alexander the Great. So once again, a lot of history, but what's it telling us? It's telling us what the Bible says in Daniel 11:4, that the rule of the empire will not go to his descendants. So in other words, another person out of play. So Olympias then took refuge in the Macedonian port of Pydna with her grandson and Roxanne at the foot of the sacred Mount Olympus. But Cassander came up from the Peloponnese in the south and besieged her. Polyperchon and King Acides tried to help her, but Cassander promised to let her live if she surrendered. Olympus did surrender, but Cassander did break his promise, and in early 316 BC he ordered her execution. So the soldiers, however, refused to kill the mother of Alexander the Great, so he resorted to organising families who had fallen victim to her in the past to stone her to death. So he must feel mightily pleased that he had nothing to do with it. Eh? Reminds you of a biblical story in the New Testament. So Roxanne and her grandson at this stage were still spared, but another person is out of play. So whilst Cassander fought to establish his authority in Greece and Macedonia, Antagonist pursued Eumenes across Asia Minor, fleeing to a fort in Nora on the border between Cappadocia and Lycaonia in 318 BC. I'm going to put up a new map for you to see, and this is where this is all heading. As I said, I know there's a lot of history here, but I can't sort of avoid it. So here we have in yellow what's going to become the Ptolemy-ruled region. So you might notice that this here, and we'll come to it in a moment, is actually now part of Ptolemy's kingdom. Up until this point in time, it's been part of this fellow Laomedon. And so that means for the people living in Jerusalem and Judea, they've now got a new unknown ruler yet again. This region, which you can see is massive, becomes what's known as the kingdom of Seleucid, named after Seleucus, who's the one who's in Babylon. And in this region up here, there's two components to it, but this is basically the regions of Greece and Macedonia together, or Thrace, I should say, and they become another force. And so in the scriptures it tells us how there was three and then it became four. So at this point in time it's going to separate into three. And in this region here we've got Antagonist, who's growing in power, and so he's going to section off a piece of this for himself. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 new kingdoms fulfilling the biblical prophecy. So I'll just explain this last portion for tonight. So it says that these people were besieged by Antagonist, and they escaped further east to join other governors beyond the Tigris River. When the summer of 317 BC arrived, this fellow called Eumenes was better prepared, and he engaged in a battle with Antagonist to the northeast of Susa, which is over here. You may remember, so to the northeast, so in this region up here somewhere, to the northeast of Susa. So I'll just find my place. And in this battle was Pithon, the satrap or the governor of Media, and Seleucus, the governor of Babylonia. And at the end of the day, Antigonus declared victory, although both sides had suffered losses and retired to fight another day. So the outcome of this battle was nothing, and both parties went off and wrote in history how they won the battle. So a usual occurrence. So regrouping, they came together in the middle of Persia in the winter of 316 BC to fight another battle called the Battle of Gabin. This time Antigonus won the battle, but the result was uncertain because Eumenes still wanted to fight the next day. So the battle didn't go ahead, though, because the soldiers of Eumenes' elite silver shields learnt their families, and 40 years of accumulated plunder had been captured by Antigonus. So what did they do? They secretly negotiated to get them back and gave up Eumenes and his senior officers in exchange. So Antigonus and his son Demetrius, who had fought this battle with him, wanted to spare him, but his officers insisted he died, and so Eumenes was executed, and the Second Diadoch War grew to a close. So with the war over, this fellow Antigonus executed the other fellow Pithon of Media and appointed Nicanor, a Macedonian officer from Cappadocia, to be the new governor of Media. So he's putting his own people into these different locations. He then reorganised the eastern part of the empire and appointed new governors before returning to Babylonia, where he treated its governor Seleucus as his subject rather than his equal. And Seleucus was very clear that Antigonus sought to rule the empire as his own and fled to Ptolemy in Egypt. So all of this is saying that they joined forces and went east and chased this fellow for this battle. They won, they came back to Babylon, and then they treated the governor Seleucus as their lower person in power, I guess, and he wasn't going to have a bar of it, because this fellow still wasn't ruling a kingdom, he was a governor as well. And so we can see now we're going to have a conflict between these two parties. So Seleucus was very clear that Antigonus sought to rule the empire as his own, and he fled to Ptolemy down here in Egypt. So lots of people do running when things don't go well for them. They go to a friend to get help and then they come back again. So Antigonus had overcome those who had opposed him, and not only was Asia Minor completely under his control, but so too was the rest of the former empire to the east. He seized a great sum of money and realised there was no longer any commander in Asia who could come against him, and he maintained a pretense of being well disposed to Cassander, but he had decided that when it suited him, he would no longer take orders from him or other kings. So he has plans to take over the whole empire as well. Now, whilst Antigonus pursued this fellow from Asia Minor to Persia, and Cassander fought to establish his authority in Greece and Macedonia, Ptolemy too furthered his own ambitions. Confident he'd secured Egypt, he now set out to secure a buffer zone by controlling the outlying territories of Cyrenaica, which is northeastern region of today's Libya, Cyprus, and Syria, which included the sub-province of Judea. And so he makes his move. History records that Cyprus became a protectorate or colony of Ptolemy's Egypt, and Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian who authored the Library of the World History, described what happened in 318 BC to the northern region of the province of Syria in his 9th volume. And it reads, "As for Egypt, Ptolemy, after he had unexpectedly rid himself of Perdiccas and the royal forces, was holding that land as if it was a prize of war. Seeing that Phoenicia and Coal Syria, as it was called, were conveniently situated for an offensive against Egypt, he set about in earnest to become a master of these regions. Accordingly, he dispatched an adequate army with Nicanor as general, a man selected from among his friends. The latter marched into Syria, took the satrap Lamodian captive, and subdued the whole land. After he had likewise secured the allegiance of the cities of Phoenicia and placed garrisons in them, he returned to Egypt." Now, further south, a fellow by the name of Eusebius Safronius, Hieronymus, if anyone can remember that. He's better known as Saint Jeremy, because obviously people can't remember these long names. He was what's known as an Illyrian, which is a person from the Balkans, in Western Balkans. And he was a priest and a historian. He also recorded what happened in the province of Judea. And he said, Ptolemy, and this is where we get our biblical connection, Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, gained control of Jerusalem and Judea by treachery and brought many captives back to Egypt. So we learn that many of the people were taken from Judea, the Jewish people. It then says, Ananias, the son of Jagus, which was the high priest of the Jews, was in his prime. And so the presence of Ananias as the high priest during the invasion of Ptolemy's forces can be verified by the Jewish historian Josephus. And he says, Now when Alexander was dead, the government was parted among his successors. About this time it was that Jaddua the high priest died, and Ananias his son took the high priesthood. This was the state of the affairs of the people of Jerusalem at this time. Now we mentioned earlier in the piece that the name of the sixth high priest, Jaddus or Jaddua, is actually listed in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 12, verses 11 and 22. And because the word of the Lord given by Gabriel to the prophet Daniel in Daniel 8 verse 5, this high priest Jaddus, the father of Ananias, the high priest, had welcomed King Alexander the Great into Jerusalem. So we mentioned this 2 lessons ago. And Judea with open arms, and no captives were taken from their homes. But Ananias, who is mentioned in conjunction with Ptolemy that we're talking about tonight, gaining control of Jerusalem and Judea by treachery, apparently he presided over the temple of Jerusalem at a time when many captives were taken back to Egypt. So it's not possible to confirm from their records, but it's speculated that Ananias had something to do with giving this person the Jewish people in order to have relief from further devastation. Okay, so there was a compromise. So in other words, what it means, he's recorded in history as a high priest who didn't stand for his people, but gave a portion of them away in order to have peace for the rest of them and not to have the temple destroyed. Okay, so we see that they didn't escape free. Remember, during the time of the Persian Empire, nothing happened to them. During the time of Alexander the Great, he actually allowed them to continue to worship as they'd always done. And now suddenly we find that this new high priest has given in to an enemy and compromised and allowed some of his people to be taken away. So we see a shift for the people, the Jewish people. Okay, so almost finished. So Antagonist was the strongest of the Diadoches, or the successors, and this made Ptolemy of Egypt very anxious, and he worried about retaining control over Egypt should he be challenged. So he decided to warn Cassander from Macedonia and Lysimachus of Thrace that they too were under threat, and in the autumn of 316 BC they agreed to form an alliance against Antagonist. So in other words, they're all getting worried because this fellow over here is getting more and more powerful, and these people have come up here, and so they're starting to feel threatened over here, and so they say, we need to form this alliance. So soon after, in winter, the 3 allied leaders sent Antagonist an ultimatum to redistribute the money he collected from the eastern provinces and to give up his conquests, but Antagonist refused, and by the spring of 315 BC, the Third Diadoch War broke out. So there's a note to that there. Antagonist Monophthalmus, One Eye, was the strongest of the Diadochi successors, and Ptolemy of Egypt joined with Cassander of Macedonia and Lysimachus of Thrace to form an alliance against him. When money was not distributed between them from the eastern provinces, and Antagonist refused to give up his conquest, the Third Diadoch War broke out between them. So this portion of history, they just keep naming them first, second, third in the names of the wars. Okay. So Antagonist was the first to make a move when he invaded Syria, and Ptolemy actually evacuated, and so we find what's just happened. I haven't shown it in the colours here, but Antagonist is now the 4th wind from heaven. So he's coming down from the north because we're looking at Judea and Jerusalem as central, and so he now comes down and he overtakes this portion of land back from the Egyptians. So suddenly this high priest Onias has just given away some of his people to satisfy Ptolemy, and suddenly we've now got somebody else, another aggressor who's come down from the north. And so when you continue reading the chapter 11, which we will do so, it's actually titled The Kings of the South and the North, because what happens is these two keep coming up and down, and who's in the middle? The Jewish people. And so we find that this becomes the story in the book of Daniel. It's actually very detailed in the book of Daniel, but the history is also very detailed, but it completely supports what actually happens. So this is the state of play. And so this we classify as the fourth wind, which comes from the north. So Ptolemy evacuated. Antagonist targeted the shipbuilding yards of Phoenicia because he needed to build ships if he was to invade Egypt and the other nations of the Aegean. So his plans were to take over the whole empire, yet another one. So Diodorus of Sicily, the Greek historian, once again described what happened in his 19th volume. So it reads, after attending to these matters, Antigonus set out for Phoenicia, hastening to organise a naval force. For it so happened that his enemies then ruled the sea with many ships, but that he had altogether not even a few. Camping at Old Tyre in Phoenicia and intending to besiege Tyre, he called together the kings of the Phoenicians and the viceroys of Syria. He instructed the kings to assist him in building ships, since Ptolemy was holding in Egypt all the ships from Phoenicia with their crews. He ordered the viceroys to prepare quickly 4.5 million measures of wheat, for such was the annual consumption. So you can imagine there's a lot of people that they're feeding here. He himself collected woodcutters, sawyers and shipwrights from all sides, and carried wood to the sea from Lebanon. So the same place where they always got timber, which was used to supply the Temple of Jerusalem being built twice, is the same place that we're talking about now, that wood is being supplied. And the reason that they were shipbuilders there was because they had the cedar trees, which is pliable and straight in the way that it grows. So it says there were 8,000 men employed in cutting and sawing the timber, and 1,000 pair of draft animals in transporting it. He established 3 shipyards in Phoenicia and a 4th in Cilicia, the timber for which was brought from Mount Taurus. There was another also in Rhodes, where the state agreed to make ships from imported timber. So there's this whole activity of building ships. Now when Perdiccas, the first regent of the Macedonian Empire, was killed, and the Treaty of Triparadisus was formed to keep the empire together, Ptolemy had seized Tyre in violation of the treaty. It was Antagonist who should have been in control of this city, and he wanted this strategic port back for himself. So after taking control of the port cities of Phoenicia and reaching Tyre, he set siege by blockading the city because its powerful fortress walls were too difficult to overcome. So we're going to go back, last note, to Diodorus, the Greek historian, for what happens. It says, while Antigonus was busy with these matters, and after he had established his camp near the sea, Seleucus, the former governor of Babylonia, was now served as the admiral of Ptolemy's naval fleet. Remember, he ran away to join him. And he arrived from Egypt with 100 ships, which were royally equipped and which sailed excellently. As he sailed contemptuously along past the very camp, men from the allied cities and all who were cooperating with Antigonus were downhearted, for it was very clear that since the enemy dominated the sea, they would plunder the lands of those who aided their opponents out of friendship for Antigonus. Antigonus, however, bade them be of good courage, affirming that in the very summer he would take the sea with 500 vessels. So in other words, the people are caught in the middle of this power struggle between these two warring parties. So after summoning ships from Rhodes and equipping most of those that had been built, they sailed against Tyre, although he pressed the siege with vigour for a year and 3 months, controlling the sea and preventing food from being brought in. Yet after he had reduced the besieged to extreme want, he permitted the soldiers who had come from Ptolemy to depart each with his own possessions, but when the city capitulated, he introduced into it a garrison to watch it closely. So at the end of the day, he got this island, or the former island, back at Tyre. So this was now back in the control of Antagonist. And so we arrive at this point, so we're at the end of tonight's lesson. It's very historical, but all of it pays mention to exactly what the Bible said would happen. Now, although Ptolemy's army commander Nicanor took the satrap or the governor Laomedon captive and subdued the whole land, Ptolemy from Egypt only ruled for 3 years before Antagonist invaded the province of Syria from the north to take it for his own. What we have to look at in this is that God had protected Zadok, who's the forefather of Jesus, in the small town of Bethlehem where he lived during the treacherous invasion of Ptolemy's army. But now, with the new invasion from the north, the future once again becomes uncertain. What we do know, however, is the genealogy of Jesus says that from his seed will come a son called Akim, A-K-I-M, which we find in Matthew chapter 1 verse 14, who will in turn be the next forefather of another 6 generations, from whom will come the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so that brings us to the end of the lesson. But in essence, what we're seeing is we've seen the formation of 3 distinct regions, which is about to become 4, which will fulfill what the biblical prophecy is saying. The 4 winds of heaven, they're talking about these new leaders who are amassing power, and they're going to come from these 4 different regions which we've seen tonight. And so this part of the journey, we find that each of these descendants in the Bible, they don't have a personal story, but they're right smack in the middle of all of these events that are going on in history. And these events are all told of before they happen by Daniel. And so, as I said, at this point in time, if you actually look at the book of Daniel 11, it's actually quite a large chapter. And in fact, it's the chapter that runs all the way up to chapter 12, of course, which is titled End Times. Okay? So in this particular chapter, all of the events that are going to happen are encapsulated in this one chapter. So it's almost like taking line by line of the book of Daniel, and you can align the historical events that occur with it. And so that's part of the journey of what we're doing. This is the portion of the Bible that we have remaining that still tells the story of what happened to the Jewish people. Okay, so we'll draw to a close on that note. As I said, we'll pick up from next week with a new descendant, Akim, and we'll continue on with Daniel chapter 11, and we'll follow through those events that it speaks of there.